standing there in the Phoenix Whole Foods parking lot. My cart full of quinoa and kombucha for my daughter's visit, I nearly dropped my reusable bags. Robert Castellano. The same crooked smile, though his dark hair had turned silver. And those laugh lines had deepened into permanent grooves. My heart did something it hadn't done since 1982. It completely forgot how old I was supposed to be. Let me back up a bit. I'm Margaret Maggie to anyone who's known me more than 5 minutes. 74 years young, as they say here in Sun City. West, though I've never been one for those patronizing phrases about aging. I moved to Arizona 3 years ago, not for the typical retirement community shuffle, but because my lungs finally won the argument with my stubbornness about needing drier air. After decades of Seattle rain. The thing about seeing someone from your past when you're in your 70s is that it hits different than those reunion moments you see in movies. There's no dramatic music, no slow motion running. There's just the sudden weight of all those years, collapsing into a single moment, and the bizarre realization that underneath all this lived experience, some part of you is still 28 and wildly in love with someone you never quite got over. Robert and I had worked together at Boeing, back when neither of us knew what we were doing with our lives. He was in engineering, I was in procurement. We fell into each other the way you do when you're young. Completely, recklessly, without considering consequences. For 2 glorious years, we were that couple everyone envied. We'd eat lunch together every day in the courtyard. Spent weekends hiking the Cascades, made elaborate plans for a future that included a craftsman house in Wallingford and maybe 3 kids. Then his wife called my apartment one Tuesday evening. Yes, you heard that right. His wife. I remember every detail of that phone call. Her name was Carol, and she was surprisingly calm. She told me she was 3 months pregnant, that she'd known about me for 6 months. That she was calling because Robert couldn't seem to make a choice. So she was making it for him. She wasn't cruel about it. If anything, that made it worse. She sounded tired, defeated, like someone who'd already grieved, and was just handling the paperwork. The details don't matter now, 43 years later. What matters is that I walked away, moved to Seattle, married a good man named Dennis, raised 3 kids, and built a life that had nothing to do with Robert Castellano. Dennis passed 5 years ago from pancreatic cancer. And I thought I was done with the big feelings. I thought 74 meant peaceful. Gardening and babysitting grandkids over FaceTime. But there he was, examining avocados like they held the secrets of the universe. I could have walked away. Probably should have. My therapist, yes, we have therapists at 74. And anyone who thinks otherwise is living in the wrong century. Would have called this a moment of choice. But my feet moved before my brain could stop them. The conversation started exactly as awkwardly as you'd imagine. He looked up from the avocados, and his face went through about 6 different expressions before landing on something between joy and terror. We stood there like idiots for a good 10 seconds before he finally said my name like a question. The funny thing about being in your 70s is that you don't have time for the games anymore. No pretending you're fine when you're not, no acting like seeing each other means nothing. He told me his wife had passed 8 years ago from Alzheimer's. The way his voice caught on the word Alzheimer's told me everything about those final years. I told him about Dennis, about the 4 months from diagnosis to goodbye. About how I still sometimes set 2 coffee cups out in the morning. We stood there in produce, 2 widowed seniors, having a moment that would have been impossible to explain to the young couple buying organic kale next to us. He suggested coffee. Not sometime, not let's exchange numbers and maybe connect, but right. Then, leaving our carts by the avocados like rebellious teenagers, the Starbucks inside Whole Foods became our unlikely reunion spot. All bright lights and young baristas who called us both "sweetie" without a trace of irony. Here's what they don't tell you about reconnecting at our age. You can't pretend the years didn't happen. Robert's hands shook slightly from essential tremor. I had to put on reading glasses to see the menu. We both ordered decaf because caffeine after 2 p.m. meant staring at the ceiling until 3 a.m. But somehow, none of that mattered. He lived in Scottsdale, only 20 minutes from my Sun City West townhouse. He'd moved there to be closer to his daughter after his wife passed. The coincidence felt too big to be random. Though I've never been one for signs from the universe. We talked for 3 hours that first day. Until the barista started giving us looks that suggested we should probably order something else or leave. Robert told me about the years between, how he'd stayed married, tried to make it work, raised 2 sons who were now engineers like him. He'd retired at 68 and taken up photography, of all things. Started traveling to national parks with his camera, creating these stunning landscape prints that he sold at art fairs. His whole face lit up when he talked about capturing the perfect light at sunrise in Yosemite, or the way shadows played across the Grand Canyon at sunset. I found myself watching his hands as he described framing a shot. Those same hands that used to draft blueprints now creating art. He told me about Carol's decline, how it started with forgetting where she put her keys and ended with her not recognizing their sons. He talked about the guilt of feeling relieved when she finally passed, how the grief was complicated by the fact that he'd been mourning her for years before her body caught up. He said the worst part was that in her lucid moments, she'd apologize for that phone call 43 years ago. And he never knew if she really remembered or if it was just neurons misfiring. I told him about my life. Too, the teaching career that started as a backup plan and became a calling. 22 years in the classroom, teaching 4th grade. Watching hundreds of kids discover they could read, really read, not just sound out words. The kid who'd been labeled learning disabled who ended up getting into Harvard. The girl who'd never spoken in class until the day she read her poem about her grandmother aloud. Then the move to administration, which I'd resisted until Dennis convinced me I could help more kids as a principal. The Ph.D. I'd earned at 52, just to prove I could, writing my dissertation on adaptive learning techniques. While managing a school and raising teenagers, I told him about Dennis, how we'd met at an education conference, where he was presenting on innovative math curricula, how he'd pursued me with the patience of a saint, understanding he was competing with a ghost, how we'd built something solid and real, different from the fire I'd had with Robert but no less meaningful. Our Sunday morning ritual of crosswords and farmers market trips. The way he'd held my hand through my mother's dementia, never once pointing out the irony that I was watching someone else forget everything while trying to forget nothing myself. How Dennis and I had traveled to 30 countries. Always saying we'd go back to our favorites when we had more time, not knowing time would run out. The trip to Vietnam where we'd gotten food poisoning and spent 3 days taking turns being sick. While the other one read aloud from bad mystery novels. The anniversary in Paris where Dennis had tried to recreate a scene from a romantic movie. And ended up falling in the Seine. The last trip to New Zealand when he was already sick. But pretending not to be, and how he'd insisted on doing the bungee jump anyway. Because what was cancer compared to throwing yourself off a bridge? The thing that surprised me most was how easy it was to talk to Robert. Not easy like simple nothing about reconnecting with your first love. At 74 is simple. But easy like breathing, like we'd just pressed pause for 4 decades. And now pressed play again. He still talked with his hands when he got excited. I still laughed too loud when something really got me. We were fundamentally the same people, just wrapped in older packaging. He asked if he could see me again. Not like a date, he clarified quickly. Then immediately took it back because why shouldn't it be like a date? We were adults. More than adults, we were senior adults with AARP cards and Medicare plans. If we wanted to date, who was going to stop us? I said yes before I could overthink it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from caffeine, we'd been religiously decaf, but from something else. Hope, maybe? Terror? Some combination of emotions. I thought I'd retired. Along with my work wardrobe. I called my sister Ellen in Portland at midnight. Forgetting the time difference meant it was perfectly reasonable there. Ellen listened to me babble for 20 minutes. Before cutting in with her trademark directness. She reminded me that I'd mentioned Robert exactly 3 times in 40 years. But each time with a wistfulness I used for nothing else. She said Dennis himself had once asked her if I'd ever truly gotten over that Boeing guy. I'd been horrified she'd told me this, but Ellen just laughed. She said Dennis knew he had my present and future. And he was secure enough to know that was enough. She also said Dennis had told her once, near the end, that if anything ever happened with that Boeing guy, after he was gone, I should go for it. I cried then, really cried, for the first time since the funeral. Our first real date was 5 days later. Robert picked me up in his Subaru Outback. The official car of Arizona retirees, and I felt 16 again. If 16 came with compression socks and a pill organizer. He'd made reservations at some fancy place in Old Town Scottsdale. But we never made it. Instead, we ended up at In-N-Out Burger, sitting in his car in the parking lot. Eating animal-style fries and talking about everything and nothing. He told me he'd thought about looking for me over the years. Especially after social media became a thing. But he'd always stopped himself. Thinking he had no right to disrupt my life after how things ended. I admitted I'd cyberstalked him exactly once, found his LinkedIn profile, saw the photo with Carol and their boys at what looked like a company picnic. And immediately closed my laptop like it had burned me. We talked about the weird grief of losing spouses. How it's nothing like the movies make it seem. How you get angry at them for dying, then guilty for being angry. How you find yourself having conversations with empty rooms. How the first time you laugh after they're gone feels like betrayal, and the first time you forget to be sad feels worse. Robert said he'd kept Carol's coffee mug on the kitchen counter for 3 years before his daughter gently suggested, Maybe it was time to put it away. I told him I still had Dennis's reading glasses on his nightstand. Like he might come back for them. That was 6 months ago, and let me tell you. Dating in your 70s is both exactly what you'd expect and nothing like you'd imagine. First of all, everyone has opinions. My daughter Claire, bless her heart, went through all 5 stages of grief. When I told her I was seeing someone, she kept saying things like, "Mom, you need to be careful," as if I might get pregnant or something. She actually sat me down with a PowerPoint presentation about elder fraud. A PowerPoint. With transitions and everything. Slide 4 was about Nigerian princes, which I found mildly offensive. My son Michael wanted to run a background check. He showed up at my house with his laptop and his serious lawyer face, explaining about romance scams and elder abuse. I let him go on for 10 minutes. Before mentioning that Robert and I had known each other since before Michael was born. The way his face went from concerned son to confused child was priceless. He still ran the check though. Found 2 speeding tickets from the 90s and a noise complaint from 2018. When Robert's photography club had gotten rowdy at his house, he seemed disappointed there wasn't more dirt. My youngest, Jenny, was the only one who seemed genuinely happy. Probably because she'd been trying to set me up with every widower in her neighborhood. For the past 3 years. She'd even made me a Tinder profile without my knowledge. Which I'd discovered when some gentleman named Harold showed up at my yoga class. Looking for Sexy Maggie 74. The horror of that still haunts me. Jenny just wanted me to have someone to do things with. Which is such a sad way to think about companionship, but also not entirely wrong. Robert's sons were equally delightful. His eldest, Robert Jr., wanted to know about my intentions with his father. We met at a Denny's his choice. Probably thinking neutral territory would be best. He came armed with questions, literally had them typed out on his phone. Financial questions, health questions, living arrangement questions. Did I own my home? Was I financially stable? What was my health status? Did I have any debt? What about my family medical history? I answered them all with more patience than I'd had. As a principal dealing with helicopter parents. Then I pulled out my own phone and started asking him questions. What was his relationship with his father really like? How often did he visit? When was the last time he'd seen his dad genuinely happy? The shift in power dynamic was almost comical. Finally, I asked him one question. What would make you feel safe about this? He thought for a long moment. Then said he just didn't want his dad to get hurt again. The again hung between us, and I realized he wasn't just talking about his mother's death. His younger son, Marcus, was easier. He called me one evening, no Denny's required, and simply said his dad hadn't taken a decent photo of anything but landscapes in 8 years. But suddenly his phone was full of pictures with me in them. That was all he needed to know. Though he did add that if I hurt his father, he knew how to make bodies disappear. Which he immediately followed with, kidding, in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely kidding. But here's what the kids didn't understand initially. We weren't the same people who'd hurt each other 43 years ago. That Robert was young, confused, trying to have everything without losing anything. That Maggie was idealistic, unwilling to compromise. Believing love should be perfect or not at all. These versions of us had been through marriages, raised children, buried spouses, survived. Cancer scares him and heart surgery me. We knew exactly how precious time was and how stupid it was to waste it on anything that didn't bring joy. The heart surgery had been 3 years ago. A valve replacement that was supposed to be routine but turned into a 10-hour ordeal. I'd woken up alone. Dennis was already gone. The kids all lived out of state. The nurse had asked if there was anyone they should call. And I'd said no, there's no one, and meant it. That loneliness was different from grief. It was structural, foundational. Meeting Robert again didn't fix that loneliness. I'd already done that work myself. But it did make me realize I'd been confusing alone with lonely. Our first official date was to the Musical Instrument Museum in Phoenix. Such a 70-something choice, I know, but it was perfect. We wandered through exhibits wearing those audio guides. Occasionally sharing what we were hearing, comfortable with silence in a way we never could have been when young. In the African section, Robert suddenly grabbed my hand when drums started playing through our headphones. And we stood there like that for the entire recording. Just holding hands and listening to rhythms from across the world. There was a moment in the American section where we heard a recording from 1979, the year we'd met, and Robert stopped walking entirely. He told me he'd kept a mixtape I'd made him that year in his garage for decades. Through moves and marriages and life changes. Carol had found it once while they were packing and asked about it. He'd told her it was from college, which wasn't entirely a lie. She'd thrown it away, and he'd been relieved and devastated in equal measure. Afterward, we had dinner at this little Italian place he knew, where the owner came out and chatted with us about his grandmother's recipes. Robert ordered wine. I stuck with water because wine gives me headaches now. These are the unglamorous truths of senior romance nobody puts in the movies. The way he automatically asked for a booth instead of a table. Because it's easier to slide in than navigate chairs. How we both put on reading glasses to see the menu. Comparing prescriptions like trading cards. The automatic reach for the Tums he keeps in his pocket. Because Italian food doesn't sit like it used to. The owner, Antonio, assumed we'd been married forever. And started telling us how lucky we were to still have each other after all these years. Robert and I exchanged glances, neither correcting him. It was easier than explaining, but also, in that moment, it felt true. We did have each other after all these years. Just with a 43-year intermission. The physical part, yes, I'm going there. Because pretending seniors don't think about intimacy is ridiculous was complicated. Not complicated bad, just complicated different. When you're young, attraction is all fire and urgency. At 74, it's more like a warm bath. Comforting, gradual, no less meaningful. But definitely requiring more communication about what works and what doesn't. The first time Robert kissed me, really kissed me, not just a peck on the cheek. We were sitting on my couch, watching the Great British Baking Show of all things. It was the episode with the collapsed soufflés. And we were both laughing at Paul Hollywood's disappointed face when Robert turned to me and asked, "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The formality of it should have been mood-killing, but instead it was perfect. When you're 74, consent isn't just sexy, it's necessary. Bad hips and heart conditions require communication. The kiss itself was nothing like our kisses 40 years ago. Those had been desperate, hungry things, full of promise and possibility. This kiss was softer, more grateful, acknowledging all the life that had happened between our last kiss and this one. When we pulled apart, Robert said his lips were numb, and for a moment I panicked, thinking he was having a stroke. But then he laughed and said it was just nerves. We'd both survived actual medical emergencies. And here we were getting worked up over a kiss. My friend Barbara from Water Aerobics said I was glowing. She'd been widowed 12 years and claimed she was done with men. But she wanted every detail about Robert. We had coffee after class, me still in my swimming suit, with my hair dripping chlorine water, and I told her about the kiss. She asked if everything still worked, which is the kind of question you can only ask after 70. I told her we were taking things slow, and she laughed so hard she nearly choked on her latte. Honey, she said, at our age, slow is all we've got. The Widows' Club, as we jokingly called ourselves, was divided. Patricia thought I was brave. She'd been with her husband 51 years when he passed and couldn't imagine starting over. Linda thought I was crazy. Her second husband had turned out to be after her first husband's pension, and she'd sworn off romance entirely. Susan just wanted to know if Robert had any single friends, preferably with their own teeth and driver's license, she specified, which seemed like a low bar but apparently wasn't. Here's something else about dating at our age. You can't separate the person from their whole life. Robert came with 43 years of stories I wasn't part of, photos of grandkids I didn't know, inside jokes with his sons I'd never understand. His refrigerator was covered with grandkid art and graduation photos, soccer schedules and concert programs. A whole life lived without me, evidence on every surface. I came with my own full life too. My house was a shrine to my career. And family photos from my principal days, awards from the district, pictures of my kids at every age. Dennis and me at various destinations around the world. The first time Robert came over, he spent an hour looking at everything. Not jealous but curious, trying to piece together the Maggie he'd missed. He stopped at our wedding photo. Dennis and me looking impossibly young and hopeful. Robert said Dennis looked like a good man, and I said he was. There was no jealousy in it, just acknowledgement. We were too old for jealousy, too aware of how love isn't finite or exclusive. You can love multiple people in a lifetime, differently but not less. There was this weird dance of trying to blend our present, while honoring our pasts. The first time I went to his house, there were still photos of his late wife, Carol, everywhere. Their wedding photo in the hallway, family portraits through the decades. A particularly beautiful shot of her in the garden she'd loved. It didn't bother me the way it might have when I was younger. She was part of his story. Dennis was part of mine. Robert told me Carol had been a good wife, a devoted mother, that their marriage had been solid if not passionate. They'd been partners in the business of life, raising kids, paying mortgages, attending school plays and soccer games. He'd loved her, truly, just differently than he'd loved me. I understood that. Dennis and I had had the same thing, a love built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Comfortable and sustaining but never quite touching that deep place that had been scorched and sealed by first love. We found our rhythm in the small things. Tuesday morning breakfasts at the Henhouse Cafe. where the waitress, Dolores, started bringing Robert's black coffee and my Earl Grey tea before we even sat down. She'd wink at us like we were teenagers on a date, which was both embarrassing and delightful. Thursday afternoon walks at the Desert Botanical Garden, early enough to avoid the heat, but late enough that the tourists had cleared out. We had a favorite bench near the butterfly pavilion where we'd sit and watch the monarchs, neither of us mentioning that we were both catching our breath. Sunday crosswords together became our ritual. Him with the New York Times, me with the LA Times. Comparing clues and arguing about whether proper nouns were cheating. Robert always did his in pen, which I found both arrogant and attractive. I used pencil and wasn't ashamed of the eraser marks. Sometimes we'd work in comfortable silence, sometimes we'd read clues aloud. Sometimes we'd give up entirely and watch hummingbirds at my feeder instead. He started teaching me photography, though I was a terrible student. My hands weren't steady enough for his standards, and I had no patience for waiting for the perfect light. But I loved watching him work, the way he'd go completely still. When he saw something worth capturing, how he'd take 20 shots of the same cactus flower to get one that satisfied him. He gave me an old digital camera of his to practice with, and I mainly took blurry photos of my grandkids on FaceTime. But he'd critique them like they were fine art. I taught him to play pickleball, which was hilarious because neither of us could move fast enough to be truly competitive. We'd join the beginners group at the community center. All of us over 70, all of us pretending our joints didn't scream with every lunge. Robert's tremor made serving interesting. The ball would wobble in his hand before he hit it, adding an unintentional spin that occasionally worked in his favor. My bad knee meant I couldn't pivot quickly, so I developed a strategy of just standing in one place and hoping the ball came to me. We were terrible and we didn't care. The kids started coming around when they saw how happy we were. Claire noticed I was cooking again. Really cooking, not just heating up Trader Joe's meals. She found me making Dennis's mother's complicated lasagna recipe. The one with homemade pasta that took all day. When she asked why, I told her Robert was coming for dinner. She stayed to meet him properly this time. Not the awkward ambush she'd attempted the first time she'd found out about him. That dinner changed everything with Claire. She watched Robert help me in the kitchen without being asked, knowing where things were because he'd been there enough times. She saw how he automatically moved my reading glasses from the counter, where I'd forgotten them, to the table where I'd need them. She noticed how we moved around each other, with the comfortable choreography of people who'd learned each other's patterns. After he left, she hugged me and said, "Dad would have liked him." Coming from Claire, who'd been Daddy's girl through and through, this was everything. Michael warmed up after he and Robert played golf together. Apparently Robert had told him about the Boeing years, about how he'd screwed up with me, about the regret he'd carried for 4 decades. Michael, who was going through his own divorce, found this honesty disarming. He told me later that Robert had given him advice about not letting guilt define your future, about how sometimes the best apology is living better. They golf together monthly now, and sometimes I catch Michael calling Robert for advice about things he won't discuss with me. Jenny just liked that I was smiling in all my photos again. She'd been documenting my moods via our family group chat photos. apparently keeping a secret tally of genuine smiles versus forced ones. She sent me a graph, an actual graph, showing my happiness index over the past year. The uptick after meeting Robert was statistically significant. She said, using the data analysis skills from her marketing job to prove I was better with him than without. Robert's sons took longer. But eventually, they saw their dad picking up his camera again. Planning trips, talking about the future in a way he hadn't since their mother got sick. Marcus started sending me his dad's old photos, the ones from before Carol's illness, showing me who Robert had been when life was simpler. There was one of him teaching Marcus to ride a bike, Robert running behind with his arms outstretched, ready to catch but hoping not to need to. That's what love looked like at any age, being ready to catch someone, but hoping they could fly on their own. 3 months in, we took our first trip together, Sedona, because of course, every Arizona senior couple has to do Sedona. It's basically a law. We hiked the easy trails, the ones marked moderate. That would have been barely worth it in our 30s. But the red rocks were just as stunning when you're moving slowly. Maybe more so because you have time to really see them. Robert photographed everything, the landscape, the light, and occasionally me, though I protested every time. He had this way of catching me when I wasn't paying attention, when I was just looking at something that made me happy. Those photos were different from the posed ones. In them, I could see what he saw, not a 74-year-old woman with wrinkles and age spots, but just Maggie, delighted by the world. That trip was when we had the talk. Not the, where is this going, talk at our age. You know exactly where everything is going, and it's not as far as you'd like. But the practical talk, the what if one of us gets sick talk, the how do we handle holidays with kids talk, the are we doing separate houses or moving in together talk. We were sitting on the balcony of our hotel room, yes. We'd gotten just one room, and isn't it ridiculous that I feel the need to mention that? Watching the sunset paint the rocks impossible shades of orange and pink. Robert's camera sat unused on the table beside him, the light perfect and ignored. He said he'd rather look at me than the rocks, which would have been cheesy from anyone else but made me tear up when he said it. He told me he loved me then, said he'd probably never stopped loving me, even when he'd loved Carol too. He said love wasn't the finite resource we pretend it is when we're young. That hearts expand with use, not contract. He said waking up after Carol died had been like surfacing from deep water, gasping and disoriented. Not sure he wanted to breathe again. But then he'd seen me by the avocados, and suddenly breathing seemed worth the effort. I told him I loved him too, had probably never stopped. Which was its own kind of terrifying admission. Loving someone for 43 years without them knowing felt like the worst kind of time waste, except it wasn't wasted. That love had informed how I'd loved Dennis, how I'd raised my kids, how I'd lived my life. It was the baseline melody that other harmonies built on. We decided to keep our separate houses for now. Independence at our age is hard won and not easily surrendered. But we also decided to be intentional about our time together. No pretending we had decades to figure things out. No waiting for the perfect moment. Every moment at 74 is both perfect and imperfect, blessed and limited. We established a schedule that would have seemed rigid to our younger selves, but felt like freedom now. Robert comes over Monday, Wednesday, and Friday nights. I go to his place Tuesdays and Thursdays. Weekends we play by ear, depending on kids' visits and doctor's appointments. And all the other non-negotiable parts of senior life. We each maintain our own space, our own friendships, our own routines. But we weave them together like a tapestry, each thread distinct, but part of a larger picture. The community response was hilarious. Sun City West is like high school with arthritis. Everyone knows everyone's business, and a new romance is prime gossip material. The pickleball ladies wanted to know everything. Was he a good kisser? Yes. Did he have his own teeth? Mostly. Could he still drive at night? With glasses. Was he on Viagra? None of your business, Sandra. The golf guys gave Robert good-natured grief about being back in the game. They'd make jokes about him having a spring in his step, which was ironic since he'd just had cortisone shots in both knees. But they also started inviting me to their couples' dinners, accepting me as Robert's partner without question. Which was touching in its simplicity. The Widows' Club was split between those who were inspired, and those who thought we were tempting fate. As if fate needed tempting at our age. Patricia started online dating after seeing how happy I was. Though she insisted on meeting everyone at the police station. For the first date, which limited her options. Linda remained skeptical but helped me pick out a new dress for Robert's photography exhibition, muttering about not trusting men while also insisting I show more cleavage. Susan actually found romance with Robert's friend Howard from the photography club. Though she insisted it was just companionship until we caught them making out at the community pool like teenagers. We started doing couples things, which sounds ridiculous when you say it about septuagenarians, but there it is. Dinner with his friends from the photography club, where I learned to smile through conversations about apertures and shutter speeds. Dancing at the community center's monthly social, where the DJ played music from the 60s and 70s and everyone pretended their hips didn't hurt. We even joined a cooking class together, Mediterranean cuisine for healthy aging, where we were the youngest couple there, if you can believe it. The cooking class was where I met Rose, 93 years old, and newly married to her second husband, Frank, who was 89. They'd met at their retirement home and decided to get married because, as Rose put it, why waste time at our age? She told me the secret to senior romance was low expectations and high tolerance. Also, separate bathrooms if possible. Frank nodded along, either agreeing or just hard of hearing. They held hands through the entire class, even while chopping vegetables, which was both dangerous and adorable. 6 months in, and we've found our groove. Robert comes over Monday mornings with fresh bagels from Goldstein's, the only decent Jewish deli in the area. We read the paper together, actual paper, because we're old and stubborn. Commenting on the news, doing the crossword, arguing about politics. Even though we largely agree. Wednesday evenings, we cook together at my place. He's teaching me to make his mother's red sauce, a recipe he'd never even shared with Carol. Friday nights are for movies at his house, where he has the better TV and surround sound that makes my hearing aids whistle. The intimacy question comes up more than you'd think. Usually from younger people who can't imagine seniors as complete humans. Yes, things work differently at 74. Yes, it requires more patience, humor, and occasionally, medical intervention. But the closeness, the tenderness, the simple pleasure of skin against skin, that doesn't age out. If anything, it becomes more precious because you know how finite it all is.